Marco Salvatore had spent the first 28 years of his life being completely overlooked. In the bustling neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where everyone knew everyone else's business, Marco somehow managed to blend into the background like wallpaper that nobody noticed anymore. He worked at his uncle's small grocery store, restocking shelves and sweeping floors while watching life happen around him rather than to him. Every morning, Marco would unlock the store at 6 sharp, arrange the newspapers by the front door, and prepare for another day of invisible existence. Customers would walk past him as if he were furniture, talking over him to his Uncle Sal about neighborhood gossip, family celebrations, and business deals. Women his age would glance right through him when he tried to make conversation. Even his own family seemed to forget he was in the room during Sunday dinners. The grocery store sat on the corner of a street where bigger things were always happening. Black cars with tinted windows would pull up regularly, and men in expensive suits would step out to conduct quick conversations with certain shop owners. Marco watched these interactions with growing curiosity, noting how these well-dressed visitors commanded immediate respect and attention wherever they went. Store owners would drop everything to accommodate them, offering coffee, clearing tables, speaking in hushed, respectful tones. One particular man caught Marco's attention more than the others. Vincent the Lion Romano was a mountain of a person who carried himself with the kind of confidence that made rooms go quiet when he entered. Vincent had thick silver hair, hands like baseball gloves, and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. When Vincent walked down the street, people stepped aside automatically. Shop owners would rush outside to greet him personally. Even the local police officers would nod respectfully when their paths crossed. Marco began studying Vincent's movements, learning his patterns without really understanding why. Vincent would visit the butcher shop every Tuesday morning, stop by the bakery each Friday afternoon, and conduct longer meetings at the social club across the street every weekend. During these observations, Marco started noticing details that others seemed to miss. He saw which cars followed Vincent at a distance, which people crossed the street to avoid him, and which businesses seemed to prosper after his visits, while others struggled. The breakthrough moment came during a particularly busy afternoon when 2 rival groups decided to settle a dispute right in front of Uncle Sal's store. Voices were rising, hands were moving toward jacket pockets, and the situation was escalating quickly toward violence. Marco watched from behind the counter as Vincent appeared seemingly from nowhere, walking calmly between the 2 groups. Vincent didn't raise his voice or make any threatening gestures. He simply started talking in a tone so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear him. Within 5 minutes, handshakes were being exchanged, apologies were being offered, and both groups were walking away in opposite directions. The entire confrontation had been dissolved through nothing more than Vincent's presence and a few carefully chosen words. That evening, as Marco was closing the store, Vincent approached the front door. For the first time in years, someone was actually seeking him out for conversation. Vincent had noticed Marco's constant attention and wanted to understand what the quiet grocery store worker found so fascinating about his daily routines. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours. Vincent was impressed by Marco's observational skills and his ability to remember small details that most people overlooked entirely. Marco had noticed that Vincent always checked his surroundings twice before entering any building, that he never sat with his back to a door, and that he could remember the names of every person he met, no matter how briefly. Vincent began testing Marco's memory and attention to detail with small tasks. He would ask Marco to deliver messages to specific people, remember exact conversations, or observe certain situations, and report back with complete accuracy. Marco excelled at every assignment, proving himself to be reliable, discreet, and surprisingly insightful about human behavior and neighborhood dynamics. As weeks turned into months, Vincent started involving Marco in more significant activities. Marco would accompany Vincent to meetings, always staying in the background, but absorbing every word, every gesture, every unspoken agreement that took place. He learned how decisions were made, how respect was earned and maintained, and how problems were solved through negotiation rather than confrontation. Vincent discovered that Marco possessed a natural talent for reading people and situations. Marco could sense when someone was lying, predict how different personalities would react to various approaches, and identify potential problems before they became serious conflicts. These skills made him incredibly valuable to Vincent's operations, even though Marco was still largely invisible to everyone else in their circle. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Marco's confidence began growing as he realized that his observations and insights were genuinely valued. He started speaking up during discussions, offering suggestions that often proved to be exactly what was needed. Vincent began referring to Marco as his secret weapon, someone who could see angles and opportunities that more obvious players completely missed. Marco's role evolved from observer to advisor, though he maintained his unassuming appearance and quiet demeanor. This combination of invisibility and insight made him uniquely effective at gathering information, building relationships, and solving problems that stumped more traditional approaches. People would confide in Marco because he seemed harmless, never suspecting that every conversation was being carefully analyzed and remembered. By his 30th birthday, Marco had become Vincent's most trusted associate, though their relationship remained largely unknown to the wider organization. Marco still worked at his uncle's store during the day, maintaining his cover as an ordinary neighborhood guy while spending his evenings and weekends learning the intricate details of Vincent's business empire. The respect Marco had always craved was finally within reach, but it came with an understanding that true power often worked best when it remained hidden. Vincent taught him that the most dangerous person in any room was often the one that nobody paid attention to, and Marco was becoming exactly that kind of person. As Marco prepared for the next phase of his unlikely journey, he had no idea that his growing influence would soon attract the attention of someone who viewed any challenge to the established order as a personal threat. The invisible years were ending, but the real test of everything he had learned was just beginning. Vincent Romano's trust in Marco had grown to the point where he began sharing details about the more complex aspects of his organization. Marco learned that Vincent controlled a network of legitimate businesses mixed with more questionable enterprises, all held together by relationships built over decades. The bakery provided a front for money transfers, the construction company handled disposal of problems, and the social club served as headquarters for planning and coordination. Marco's unique position as Vincent's hidden advisor allowed him to see how the entire operation functioned from the inside. He attended meetings where decisions were made about territory boundaries, business partnerships, and conflict resolution. His ability to remain unnoticed meant that visiting representatives from other organizations would speak freely in front of him, often revealing information that proved valuable later. The grocery store became an unofficial intelligence center where Marco could observe the neighborhood's daily rhythms while appearing to focus on mundane tasks like inventory and customer service. He developed a mental map of who was connected to whom, which businesses were struggling, and where opportunities might emerge. Vincent relied heavily on these insights for making strategic decisions. Marco's analytical mind began identifying patterns in how conflicts developed and how they could be prevented. He noticed that most disputes started over misunderstandings rather than genuine grievances, and that early intervention could often resolve issues before they escalated. Vincent started sending Marco to handle these preliminary negotiations because his non-threatening appearance allowed him to approach sensitive situations without raising defenses. The success of Marco's diplomatic missions enhanced his reputation within Vincent's inner circle, though he remained largely unknown to the broader organization. Senior associates began seeking Marco's advice on their own problems, recognizing that his perspective often revealed solutions that more conventional approaches had missed. His recommendations consistently proved effective, building a track record that impressed even the most skeptical veterans. Marco's growing influence attracted attention from an unexpected source. Anthony "Big Tony" Marchetti ran the largest competing organization in the area and had maintained an uneasy truce with Vincent for nearly a decade. Tony was everything that Vincent was not: loud, flashy, quick to anger, and obsessed with maintaining his reputation through displays of power and wealth. Tony had built his empire through intimidation and dramatic gestures that kept everyone around him walking on eggshells. He drove the most expensive cars, wore the most ostentatious jewelry, and made sure that every business deal included elements designed to demonstrate his dominance. His organization operated through fear rather than respect, creating an atmosphere of constant tension and competition among his associates. The first sign of trouble came when Tony's representatives began asking questions about Vincent's recent string of successful negotiations. Several disputes that should have required Tony's intervention had been resolved quietly through Vincent's people, creating the impression that Vincent's organization was becoming more effective than Tony's at handling neighborhood problems. Marco first encountered Tony during a chance meeting at a restaurant where both organizations were dining separately. Tony noticed how Vincent's associates seemed to defer to the quiet man who didn't fit the usual profile of a high-ranking member. When Tony asked his own people about Marco, they had no information to share, which only increased his curiosity and suspicion. Tony's personality made him incapable of accepting that someone he had never heard of could be wielding significant influence in his territory. He began conducting his own investigation into Marco's background, trying to understand how a grocery store worker had gained Vincent's confidence. The fact that Marco had achieved this position without Tony's knowledge felt like a personal insult. The situation escalated when Tony decided to test Marco's influence directly. He arranged for one of his associates to create a minor business dispute with a shop owner who was known to be under Vincent's protection. Tony expected Vincent to handle the situation through traditional channels, but instead, Marco appeared to negotiate a resolution that left everyone satisfied except Tony. Tony's jealousy transformed into active hostility when he realized that Marco's success was making his own organization look outdated and unnecessarily aggressive by comparison. Neighborhood business owners began expressing preferences for Vincent's diplomatic approach over Tony's heavy-handed methods, creating a perception that Vincent's leadership was more modern and effective. The breaking point came during a meeting of the area's major players to discuss territorial boundaries and business protocols. Marco attended as Vincent's advisor, sitting quietly in the background while the formal negotiations took place. When a complex dispute arose that threatened to derail the entire meeting, Marco whispered a suggestion to Vincent that provided an elegant solution acceptable to all parties. Tony watched this exchange and immediately understood that the quiet man in the corner was the real architect of Vincent's recent successes. The realization that someone he had completely underestimated was outmaneuvering him struck at the core of Tony's identity as the neighborhood's most powerful leader. Following the meeting, Tony confronted Vincent directly about Marco's role in the organization. He demanded to know why Vincent was using an unknown outsider for important decisions and suggested that Marco's involvement violated long-standing protocols about organizational hierarchy and transparency between allied groups. Vincent's response was carefully measured but firm. He explained that Marco had earned his position through demonstrated competence and loyalty, and that his methods had proven more effective than traditional approaches. Vincent also made it clear that he would not be dictating how Tony should run his organization and expected the same courtesy in return. Tony's anger at this response revealed the depth of his insecurity about Marco's success. He had built his reputation on being the most feared and respected leader in the area. But Marco's achievements suggested that intelligence and diplomacy might be more valuable than intimidation and force. This possibility threatened everything that Tony believed about power and leadership. Marco became aware of Tony's hostility through his network of contacts and observations. He recognized that Tony's jealousy was based on deeper fears about changing dynamics in their world and that direct confrontation would only escalate the situation. Marco tried to minimize his public profile while continuing to provide valuable advice to Vincent behind the scenes. However, Tony's obsession with Marco continued growing stronger. He began spreading rumors about Marco's background, questioning his loyalty, and suggesting that Vincent was being manipulated by someone whose true motivations were unclear. Tony's campaign of whispers and insinuations started creating doubt among some members of both organizations. The tension reached a critical level when Tony decided that eliminating Marco was necessary to restore the proper balance of power in the neighborhood. He began planning actions that would force Marco into the open, where traditional methods of dealing with threats could be applied. Tony convinced himself that removing Marco would prove that old-school approaches were still superior to new diplomatic strategies. Marco sensed the growing danger, but understood that retreating would abandon everything he had worked to build while potentially destabilizing Vincent's organization. He realized that Tony's jealousy had created a situation where compromise was impossible and where the only resolution would come through a direct test of their competing approaches to power and influence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Marco's quiet intelligence could overcome Tony's established dominance, and whether the rules that had governed their world for decades would survive the challenge of someone who had achieved power through completely different methods. Tony Marchetti's jealousy had consumed his judgment completely. He spent sleepless nights planning ways to expose Marco as a fraud, while simultaneously proving that traditional methods of leadership were superior to Vincent's diplomatic approach. Tony's associates watched nervously as their boss became increasingly obsessed with someone they still considered to be nothing more than a grocery store worker. The first direct move came when Tony arranged for several of his people to create simultaneous problems for businesses under Vincent's protection. The plan was designed to overwhelm Marco's ability to negotiate solutions, forcing Vincent to resort to more aggressive tactics that would demonstrate the limitations of diplomatic approaches. Marco recognized the coordinated nature of these incidents immediately. The timing was too perfect, the complaints too similar, and the demands too unreasonable to be coincidental. Rather than rushing to address each situation individually, Marco spent time analyzing the pattern and understanding Tony's underlying strategy. Vincent wanted to respond with traditional methods that would send a clear message about the consequences of challenging their organization. However, Marco convinced him that playing into Tony's expectations would validate the older man's belief that diplomacy was just a temporary facade covering the same old methods of intimidation and violence. Instead, Marco proposed a completely different approach. Rather than confronting Tony's people directly, he began reaching out to the business owners who were being pressured. Marco offered to help them understand their options and connect them with resources that could protect their interests without requiring them to choose sides in an organizational dispute. This strategy had several unexpected effects. First, it demonstrated that Vincent's organization was genuinely committed to protecting neighborhood businesses rather than just collecting tribute from them. Second, it showed that Marco's methods could address problems without creating additional conflicts. Most importantly, it made Tony's aggressive tactics look crude and outdated by comparison. Tony's response was to escalate his pressure campaign. He began making direct threats against Marco, suggesting that outsiders who interfered with established business relationships would face serious consequences. These threats were communicated through intermediaries and accompanied by subtle demonstrations of Tony's willingness to use violence when diplomacy failed. Marco understood that Tony's threats represented a fundamental challenge to everything he had built with Vincent. Backing down would not only destroy his credibility, but would also validate Tony's belief that intimidation was ultimately more powerful than intelligence and negotiation. The decisive moment came when Tony arranged for a meeting between the major neighborhood leaders to discuss what he called the Marco problem. Tony planned to use this gathering to demand that Vincent remove Marco from any position of influence and return to traditional methods of conducting business. Vincent initially resisted attending such a meeting, recognizing it as an attempt to publicly humiliate both him and Marco. However, Marco convinced Vincent that this confrontation was inevitable and that avoiding it would only give Tony more time to build support for his position among the other leaders. Marco spent days preparing for this meeting, knowing that it would likely determine his future role and possibly his survival. He studied each leader who would be attending, understanding their personalities, their business interests, and their likely reactions to different arguments and presentations. The meeting took place in the back room of a restaurant that had hosted similar gatherings for decades. Tony had arranged the seating to emphasize his seniority and importance, placing himself at the head of the table with his most loyal supporters positioned strategically around the room. When Vincent arrived with Marco, the reaction was immediate and revealing. Several leaders seemed genuinely surprised that the quiet man they had barely noticed at previous meetings was the subject of such intense controversy. Others appeared curious about what made this unremarkable person worthy of Tony's focused attention and anger. Tony opened the meeting by presenting his case against Marco in dramatic terms. He argued that allowing outsiders to gain influence within established organizations threatened the stability and traditions that had maintained peace in the neighborhood for decades. He suggested that Marco's success was based on manipulation and deception rather than genuine competence. Vincent's response was brief but pointed. He simply stated that Marco had earned his position through demonstrated results, and that any leader should be free to choose advisors based on their effectiveness rather than their conformity to traditional expectations. The moment when Marco was invited to speak for himself became the turning point of his entire transformation. For the first time in his life, he was the center of attention in a room full of powerful people who were genuinely interested in what he had to say. Marco's presentation was masterful in its simplicity and logic. He began by acknowledging the validity of concerns about maintaining stability and respecting traditions. He then methodically demonstrated how his approach had actually strengthened rather than weakened the existing system by resolving conflicts before they required dramatic interventions. Marco provided specific examples of situations where his diplomatic methods had preserved relationships, protected businesses, and maintain neighborhood peace without the costs and risks associated with more aggressive approaches. He showed how his techniques could complement rather than replace traditional methods, creating more options for handling complex situations. Most importantly, Marco addressed the underlying fear that his success represented a threat to established leaders. He explained that his goal was not to replace anyone, but to provide additional tools for solving problems that traditional approaches might not handle effectively. The reaction from the assembled leaders was overwhelmingly positive. Several mentioned specific incidents where Marco's interventions had benefited their own interests or prevented problems that could have affected their operations. Others expressed appreciation for approaches that reduced the need for violence and confrontation while still achieving necessary results. Tony's attempt to discredit Marco had backfired completely. Instead of exposing Marco as a dangerous outsider, the meeting had established him as a valuable resource whose methods enhanced rather than threatened the existing power structure. Tony found himself isolated in his opposition, with even his closest allies acknowledging the benefits of Marco's diplomatic approach. The aftermath of this meeting transformed Marco's status from Vincent's hidden advisor to a recognized leader in his own right. Other organizations began requesting his assistance with complex negotiations and sensitive situations. His reputation spread beyond the immediate neighborhood as word of his unique methods reached leaders in other areas. Marco's success had shattered the rules that had previously governed advancement within their world. He had achieved power and respect without violence, intimidation, or inherited connections. His rise demonstrated that intelligence, observation, and diplomatic skill could be as effective as traditional methods of establishing dominance. Tony's jealousy had ultimately accelerated Marco's transformation from an invisible grocery store worker to an unstoppable force within the organizational hierarchy. By challenging Marco publicly, Tony had created the circumstances that established Marco's legitimacy and demonstrated the value of his unconventional approach. The irony was perfect and complete. Tony's attempt to destroy Marco had instead launched him into a position of influence that extended far beyond what he could have achieved through Vincent's patronage alone. Marco had become exactly what Tony had feared, a new type of leader whose success challenged fundamental assumptions about power, respect, and control. Marco continued operating his uncle's grocery store, maintaining the humble facade that had served him so well. But now everyone who entered understood that they were in the presence of someone whose influence extended throughout the neighborhood and beyond. The invisible man had become unstoppable, not through force or intimidation, but through the intelligence and patience that had always been his greatest strengths. The transformation was complete. The rules were broken, and Marco Salvatore had proven that in a world that respected only power, the most dangerous person might be the one that nobody had bothered to notice.